Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for the, oh God, which one is this? This is like does anyone know? For the nth meeting of the British Postgraduate Philosophy Association Spring Seminar Series. My name's Nino Kadic, and I'm a PhD student at King's College London, and the BPPA's communications officer for this year. So we're very excited to have Eduardo Quirino from the University of Bristol here today, who is going to present the paper entitled Russellian Monism and Individuality in Quantum Mechanics. So before we get going, just a word about the seminar series and how today will run. This seminar series will meet every Friday until the 25th of June at 4 p.m. GMT every week. So you can save the link for every Friday. We have an extremely diverse and global group of graduate students, speakers who will present their research across numerous areas of philosophy in the coming weeks. The link you used to join today, like I said, will be the same for the following weeks, so just save it in your calendars as a recurring meeting. But we will also send out the details every week at the beginning of every week, along with the Zoom link on our mailing list. So to see the seminar schedule and mailing list, to sign up, you can visit our website at bppa.uk, and here's the link. This is the full schedule. Yeah, so turning to today, I'll shortly turn things over to Eduardo, who will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to all of you for a Q&A after like a 2-minute break, just to kind of collect your thoughts and so on. And the Q&A will last about 20 minutes. We shouldn't run much over the hour. So while Eduardo is speaking, please keep your mics off unless you're asking a question in the Q&A, and feel free to turn off your video for bandwidth, bring food, drinks, or pets. We are kind of very informal here. For the Q&A, we will use the hand-finger system, so hand for a new question, new line of questioning, and finger for a follow-up. And I'll remind you of that when we get there. So again, we are thrilled to have Eduardo Quirino here to talk to us, and I'll now turn things over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely happy to be here. I'm very, very happy that you selected my paper, and I hope you won't regret it at the end of this conversation. So as mentioned, the title is Russellian Monism and Individuality in Quantum Mechanics. I think in this kind of topic, it's usually good to put your cards on the table. I am a naturalist and a physicalist, but I'll try to hide this behind my arguments if I possibly can. So I'll first start with a very rough outline of the most important argument for Russellian monism and Panpsychism particularly, and later I will assess if that can be made to work. Right. So physical properties are quantitative, and experiential properties are qualitative. So here's the idea that Philip Goff, most of what I'm going to say about Panpsychism will be directly approaching Philip Goff formulation of it. So his idea is that when we started doing science back in the 17th century, we tried our best to separate the intrinsic aspects of nature from the extrinsic aspect, the relational aspects, and then we started using mathematics and experiment and etc. to study this quantitative aspect. But when we come into study consciousness, because we have a special kind of access to our conscious properties, we immediately are faced with the problem. The access we have to consciousness grants us intrinsic properties, and our science can only discuss quantitative or extrinsic properties. I'll take both terms to be synonymous, okay? Also, experiential and phenomenal properties are the same for me, for what I'm going to say. Okay, so his point is, if you just take science, it can offer you a lot of structure and causal relations and regularities, but it cannot offer you intrinsicness of and experience can offer you intrinsicness, so we kind of need to put them together, and we cannot just take one of them to overhaul nature. We have a special access to experiential property. We cannot find out about the nature of those things only using qualitative properties. Right. So here's the problem. If the qualitative properties of the word are experiential, were not experiential, then we probably wouldn't have any way of grasping it. But let's assume that it is. In this case, because we have a special access to consciousness, then we have an special access to the nature of reality itself, which is very neat. It's incredibly handy. Um, and by this side, the argument for panpsychism goes on a number of theoretical virtues such as elegancy, conceptual coherence, and well, good explanation, etc. But that's the great thing is, if panpsychism is true, then we can explain the intrinsic aspect of reality and reality altogether, which is a great thing for metaphysicians to aspire. So we should at least take it very seriously because it promises so much. So yeah, I think I covered this, but yeah, experiential properties are the ground for the causal structure world discovered by science. Pretty much, this is, as I take very grossly, what Philip Goff is trying to do, right? To ground causal structure in experience. So let's jump to materialism. Is an attempt to reduce everything to causal structure and say that that's the only thing that exists. So Goff says that taking structure to be everything is not coherent, and he says that expecting materialism to give up to us the intrinsicality that we took off from science in the 17th century is not fruitful. We have tried this, it did not work. But he also do not believe in dualism because, well, dualism have weird problems of causation. How can something outside causal spectrum to cause something that is in physical realm and stuff like this? Even property dualism faces these problems. When you look at brains, it doesn't seem that there is anything going on that we cannot explain with material things. So it doesn't seem that there is anything causally interacting with your brains to make it, which leads to property dualism being very strongly attached with phenomenalism. And that's not a view he fancies. And as we're going to see, this is actually a problem to him, Philip Goff. So Russellian Monism is a monistic view. The name is quite explanatory there. So avoid causation problems. That's, again, something we're going to check, observe with more detail. But the idea, what is meant by this is that there is no special problem of causation. There is no different materials interacting with each other, right? Which is important to remind that even for physical things, there are things that do not cause each other in spite of being physical. So there are the metaphysical problems of causation and the specific problems of causation. This is good to keep in mind because it's going to be important later. And it's by it being neutral, it kind of rejects the hard problem because it accepts that are non-physical facts. It's just that those new non-physical facts do not need to be entailed, and they are not they do not constitute a different ontological kind. It's just a different way of things to be. Though that's a relief. After all, we've been discussing dualism and materialism for quite a while and have not gained much ground in either way. But does it work? Well, no. So I think. Well, let's make a small detour, going back to discussing identity and individuality. I assume with Bueno 2014, 2 criteria for individuality that I think are very intuitive. Criteria 1, an individual is distinguishable from every other individual, and 2, individuals must be re-identified through time. But here's the important thing: as it's written in Bueno, it does have a very straightforward diachronical reading, right? At all instances of time, if you take an object, it will be able to be re-identified through that time. But this is not adequate because we're trying to discuss individuality in a synchronic understanding of the term. So what is best for us to do is to reinterpret this second criteria as a synchronic property. So even if at some points we do not have identity, the condition, at each time that I try to distinguish the object, I would be able to know that in a previous time, that object was the one I identified earlier, right? So you don't need to carry on by what you establish now. You don't need to carry on to be to have your individuality all the time. But for every instance that we try to specify which object that one is, we need to be able to do for all the times we had specified already. So the principle of identity of indiscernibles is very important for synchronic identity and individuality. And this is as it's usually stated for all f, x, and y. If f, fx, if and only if f, y, for then x equals y. That is, for all properties, that if an object has, for all objects and all properties, if an object share all his properties with another object, they are the same. But what kind of properties are we talking about, right? After all, property is a very, very, very vague term on itself, and we should try to specify this a bit better. So the first idea is to follow Krauss and French, 2006, and specify 3 possible ways in which we could understand the property, the F property should be ranging over. So it's F could be ranging over all relational and non-relational properties of given X has at a time T. We call it PII1, principle of identity of indiscernibles 1. If it ranges over all properties except spatial temporal ones, then it's the PII2. And if we're talking only about monadic, non-relational properties, PII3, remembering we're talking about synchronic identity. But what do PII do? What's important for? Well, it links some sort of distinguishability, which is an epistemic notion, to metaphysical individuality with something in the object that arguably will grant it to it, and to logical identity. There is numerical identity. If 2 objects share, so yeah, if 2 objects share the, let's go back in. Distinguishability is the epistemic to metaphysical notion. Individuality is the thing that one object has that makes it itself, which is, as you can see, not incredibly explanatory, but that's the definition we are granted. And logical identity is the numerical cardinality of an object if it counts by 1. So if you take Frege examples like the early star, the afternoon star and the morning star, they are 2 names for this very same object. So they are logically identical because the cardinality of the statement is 1. There's only one thing that has 2 names. So if 2 things are logically identical, they're actually one object with 2 names. But individuality entails if one thing has an individuality relationship to itself, to something else, then they are going to be logically identical. And what the principle is establishing is exactly that. So it's trying to get, if you have properties of one kind or another, then you get them to making you an individual, and that individuality makes you to be one single individual object, right? But is the nice, more important question is this true? So, well, PII2 does not work on the outset because many objects in physics share all their quantitative properties and are not numerically the same, so they would fail the principle. But then we can say, well, maybe we can have intrinsic properties or spatial temporal properties that allow us to carry on the job. So can spatial temporal properties work? No. Reason 1, trajectories may presuppose individuality of their objects. So the reason 1 and 2 are about metaphysics of trajectory. Reason 2 and 3 and 4, yeah, are about physics more directly. So if you're trying to specify what a trajectory is, we can either use the objects, which in this case would not work because we're trying to give individuality for the objects in terms of the trajectory, or we can give it in terms of the individuality of the subparts of the trajectory, which is at least as hard as the beginning of the problem. right? So reason 1 and 2 is that we cannot just do individuality with trajectory, unless, of course, you feel that trajectory is a sufficiently clear notion on itself so that you don't have to explain it. I think something I would not argue against. So there are 2 reasons, in spite of that, to be not super fan of trajectory and spatial temporal properties individuating physical objects, or any object, whatever, by the way. So entanglement raises hard questions about condition 2 above. We cannot re-identify the object after an entangled state. So you take 2 fundamental entities like 2 electrons or something, and they enter in a entangled state. Even if they were obeying one and the same trajectory all along, from the moment they got entangled and they collapse into different objects again, there is no sense at all to say that this object that came out of that is the one that came from this pathway or that way. There is just no sense making this question. The properties of trajectory are not properties in quantum mechanics. We cannot use a Lero addendum. This is ignoring, for the sake of brevity, Bohemian interpretations. Okay, that that's a way you could explore easily getting out of my objections here. So yeah, entanglement case, a prima facie at least make a case against re-identifying quantum objects after they got entangled. And Bose-Einstein condensates, I think, make a more clear and straightforward case against spatial temporal individuality conditions, because we feel cool enough, and I guess so much so that its molecules start to have a very long wavelength. What were previously fermions start behaving as if they were bosons and violate Fermi exclusion principle. Violate by means they are not, it's not applicable to them anymore. But so they start to penetrate each other and occupy one single place in space and time. And because they do so, and they were fermions, so in prima facie, at least, in principle, we could do this. And metaphysical principles that don't work sometimes are poor metaphysical principles. So apparently there are the reasons that from physics and quantum mechanics to not believe in spatial temporal individuality. There are also reasons to not believe in pure specific properties individuality. There are theorems that grant that electrons and protons and bosons and fermions in general, they have only type identity. They have specific properties as an electron, and the specific protons as specific properties as a proton, etc. But each one of them must be, so that quantum mechanics can work, absolutely indistinguishable in terms of other properties. So yeah, so far the only thing that may result in us having identity in for quantum entities is intrinsical properties, which is in the literature it's called transcendental identity after post 1963. It's not a Kantian term, by the way. So you need known physical properties that are necessary and sufficient for an object to be itself. I will call any kind that do this, any kind of property that do this, Haecceitic. There are lots of other kinds of names, etc. What a Haecceitic do is to say what kind of object that thing right there is. But remember, this is granting individuality. That's also what Panpsychis and Russellian Monists were asking that physics cannot offer us. So far we are in complete agreement with Russellian Monism regarding identity, at least, and individuality. But here's the thing. Why should the Panpsychists care about the fact that so far either Haecceitism is right, or either Haecceitism is right, or there is no such thing as individuality? Well, mostly because it doesn't seem conceptually coherent to ascribe subjective properties like experience to non-individuals. That is, subjectivity is very hard to define, but it appears to mean something that's having a particular way of being regarding some context. So if you have no individuality, there is no particular way of being, there is no point of view, there is, well, nothing that I would think would make it conceptually coherent to ascribe to you to have a way it's like to be you. Because there is no you, this is the very point. So if I take it to be conceptually required by the notion of subjectivity that there are individuals that have the subjective point of view in particular. And here's what's at stake. If non-individual interpretations of quantum mechanics are correct, there is no individuality in fundamental physics. So there is no subjectivity altogether. So thus what we need is, if we're Panpsychis, is to grant a sense in which there is individuality there. But if its subjectivity requires individuality, then subjectivity cannot offer individuality by pen of vicious circularity. So does the Panpsychis need some subjectivity and some non-experiential thing to ground individuality for fundamental particles. And therefore it's fundamental that some version of principle of identity of indiscernibles work, otherwise you should not believe in individuality at all. But that individuality cannot be physical, because the very core of Russellian monism is to say that there is no such thing as a physical intrinsic property. If you say that there are any kind of brute identity or brute subjectivity, a brute individuality granted by the physicalness of matter, then you're denying Russellian monism altogether again. So let's remember P1 and P3 again. We reject the spatial studies principle of identity of indiscernibles quantifying over all properties, or only for monistic and or only intrinsical or qualitative ones, right? That's the difference between P1 and P2 and P3. We reject the spatial temporal properties as source of individuality. We reject the physical ones, in which of Russellian monism at least, and also problems that it would give on itself. So we're left only with monadic properties. P1 and P3 collapse into one position. It is all or nothing for PII3. So no pressure there. Monistic properties, please grant us individuality now. Well, as I just mentioned, subjective properties cannot be Haecceites. So it needs non-experiential versions. But the non-experiential versions of Haecceitism, well, actually Haecceitism is a bit different. It's a more model term. But anyway, Haecceitism allows for the apparent metaphysically impossible scenario in which I have all my properties switched with Eiffel Tower and continue to be me, which seems odd. Well, metaphysical intuitions vary immensely, and I'm not going to make the proper argument. I can do this in Q&A if you want. It's a quite nice argument, but yeah, just the reason two is less controversial. If Haecceitism makes me, and another Haecceitism makes you, they cannot be the very same, because otherwise they could not make me. I could become you, which is not, I suppose, not possible. So they must themselves have something that individuates them. Well, or we don't need individuality to quantum particles, but if they have something else that individuates them, it might be another Haecceitis or something else. If it's something else, well, maybe we already have it, or then Haecceitis are quite useless, or it is another Haecceitis in this gonna generate a infinite regress problem. So either it doesn't solve the problem, or it doesn't solve the problem, which is not great for a metaphysical position either. Okay, putting reason one aside, as I said, is much more controversial. But so apparently reason 2 is substantial, but we can yet save it. It's not the end of the world. We can still save PII 3. Sure, I got a message in the chat. I suppose I have a few time, but I'm quite in the end of the presentation. But can we solve it in an elegant way? Yes. So I called it the visual experiential haecceitism. Subjective properties individuate haecceities. So what makes it haecceitic? Well, it has a subjective point of view. And what makes this subjective from that one? Well, the haecceitic. There's a codependence relationship, a symmetric codependence relation between experiential properties and haecceitic properties. Right. If physical properties do not individuate, right. So now we got to the. So now we got to the implications of what we have considered so far, and you see, they're a bit dire. If EH is a form of PII tree, this means that if it is true, it cannot be vacuously so, or it would collapse all objects sharing AH into one. This means if everything that shares the same experiential haecceity is the same object, then each electron, each proton, each one must have a very specific and different one, granting not type identity, like proton experience, electron experience, but this proton experience and this electron experience, which makes each one of the objects individually and distinguishable, at least in principle, from all the others. Which, as we mentioned, which leads us to this second thing that's not super, it's not really an objection, it's just a very odd consequence. Physical properties do not individuate, and what makes a proton is their experiential haecceity, not the way they relate to other things physically. This is very controversial, very weird to think about. If every quantum entity has a point of view, then they are all different, contradicting the theorem above mentioned, the one I just said about the very important indistinguishability of each electron and each proton. This leads naturalists like me to reject the Panpsychis claim because it contradicts non-relativistic quantum mechanics. But a non-naturalist may carry on. But to save from contradiction above, the experiential haecceity must be assumed not to play any role in the causal powers, otherwise it will directly contradict results of the physical aspect of the phantom world. And this is a claim of epiphenomenalism, because what we're saying that is like the ubiquitous experience that every electron and every proton has does not alter at all the way the physical world happens. So zombies are possible even in this case, but this is just a claim that physical reality could be exactly as it is without experience. Therefore, it's not relevant to how the world is, and my movements, therefore, are not granted by my subjective feeling of agency. We get there later. Also, it not only is epiphenomenal, but it would characterize as an hidden variables interpretation of quantum mechanics if it altered the spin properties of the objects. So it would contradict Bell's theorem. That said, there is no way to formulate quantum mechanics that yields the results we have, in which the phenomenal properties play a causal role in altering spin. We take charge and mass as fundamental properties that don't change, so they couldn't change those as well. And therefore, and what's important here is that this means there's an essential notion of epiphenomenalism coming from Bell's theorem applied to EH interpretation. So it's not a metaphysical problem of causation, though. It's not because we're just considering the neutral aspect of the phantom matter, or because we're taking to be a dualistic view. It's just, as I said, some physical objects do not alter some other, do not causally interact with some other physical objects, And in this case, some fentanyl properties do not interact with some other fentanyl properties. That is, the physical properties of the fentanyl does not alter the physical properties, the experiential properties of the fentanyl, and vice versa. And here's the thing. Remember I said something about the phenomenal concept of agency? Then if the essential epiphenomenalism presented if we have that feeling of agency, and that's a concept that we cannot correctly apply about ourselves, and actually, in truth, panpsychism leads to epiphenomenalism, then what you get is a contradiction with the consciousness constraint, making panpsychisms, like his, those that accept the consciousness constraint at least, inconsistent. So we started with the assumption that Russellian Monism is possible and took what it has to say seriously. We assumed that to be conceptually necessary, the subjective requires individuality. We searched whether fundamental entities do have individuality. We saw that there are considerations that show that physics reject many sources of individuality and that Russellian monism rejects some more. We found EH to be sufficient to make Russellian panpsychism coherent, but we also found that EH leads to immensely unlikely and possibly contradictory results. I also humbly suggest that these problems are sufficient to reject panpsychism. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you had a nice time.